The dusk was lowering fast, a grey shroud of winter pressing against the valley, when Elias McGraw saw the figure in the snow. At first he thought it a fallen deer, or maybe just a shadow thrown by the wind-carved drifts. But as he drew nearer, his boots crunching slow and measured in the crusted ice, he saw the boy. Barefoot, his toes blue against the white ground. His hair tangled, stiff with frost. His lips cracked and dark with hunger. The boy did not move when Elias stopped over him. Only his chest rose faintly, like a bird's wing lifting in its last effort. Elias's breath coiled in the cold air, and he stood there longer than he ought to have, caught between habit and conscience. Years of hard living had taught him not to pick up what wasn't his. Years of silence had taught him to let the world pass by unclaimed. Yet the boy's face, half buried in the drift, stirred something Elias had long thought buried beside his wife and child. He stooped and gathered the boy in his arms. The body was lighter than it should have been, ribs sharp beneath the ragged shirt. Elias held him close, the way a man carries both weight and memory, and turned back toward the cabin that had too long stood empty of all but fire and dust. The wind followed him home, a long howl against the ridges. By the time he pushed through the cabin door, snow clung to his coat and hat brim, shaking loose on the plank floor. He laid the boy on the cot and set a fire roaring in the hearth. Sparks leapt like startled birds, casting shadows across the walls. Elias moved with a quiet urgency, stirring broth from dried beans, ladling it into a tin cup, laying his wife's old quilt over the boy's frail form. The quilt smelled faintly of cedar, though years had passed since Anna folded it away. The weight of it seemed almost too much for the boy's narrow shoulders, yet beneath it, color began to rise in his hollow cheeks. His eyelids fluttered. He whispered something, low, broken syllables in a tongue Elias did not know, and then slept. Elias sat back in the rocking chair, listening to the creak of its old bones. For a moment he could almost believe Anna's spirit sat across from him, watching the fire with that same steady calm she once held. The lantern light fell across the corner where her wedding dress lay folded in a chest, and for a heartbeat, Elias thought it glimmered like snow in sunlight. He rubbed his eyes, but the image lingered. The snow fell through the night, hard and merciless. In the morning, word of the boy's presence had spread through the settlement. Elias went into town for flour, his collar turned high, his face unreadable. But he felt the eyes. Felt the silence cut by low words in the saloon. Ranchers lost his mind, feeding an enemy pup. Man's got no kin, ain't his burden to carry. A spit into the sawdust floor, a laugh sharp as broken glass. Elias did not answer. He had long learned that words wasted breath. He bought his flour, set his coin on the counter, and walked out into the snow. Silence was his shield, the only one he trusted. Back at the cabin, the boy stirred awake, eyes wide and dark, reflecting the fire. Elias saw in them both fear and something else, something that pressed against his chest like an old scar. His son's eyes had once held the same light, before sickness had taken him. Elias set the flour on the shelf, then knelt by the cot. "You'll live," he said, voice low, almost foreign in the still room. The boy did not understand the words, but he seemed to know their shape, the way Elias's gaze held. For a moment, neither man nor child moved. Only the fire cracked, only the snow whispered against the shuttered window. Elias leaned back in his chair and stared into the flames. He had carried more than a starving child across that frozen field. He had carried his grief, his wife's memory, his son's absence, and perhaps, though he dared not name it yet, a small ember of something that might warm a man's heart again. The storm pressed against the cabin walls, but inside, a faint, stubborn fire began to burn. The nights came heavy, pressing close around the cabin with the weight of old memories. Elias dreamed of Anna often now, as if the presence of the boy had roused her ghost from its long silence. In his sleep he saw her bent over the table, shawl about her shoulders, her hands kneading bread that filled the house with warmth. He would reach for her, and always she turned, smiling at him with that quiet, steady look she wore even at the end. But the dream dissolved into cold, and Elias woke to the creak of the rocking chair, to the boy's faint murmurs in a tongue he did not know. The shawl still hung by the door, unmoved for years. Each morning as Elias pulled on his coat, his eyes caught it, its folds holding the memory of a woman's touch. Now he saw the boy watching it too, eyes narrowing as if he recognized something sacred in its stillness. When fever ran high, the boy whispered broken words, soft as the crackle of the fire. Elias could not understand them, but he knew prayer when he heard it. They sounded like calls to a mother, a plea to ancestors, or perhaps just the thin voice of hunger crying into the dark. Elias remembered another boy, himself. Remembered the day his father rode out with a pan strapped to his saddle and a promise of gold. He never came back. The memory bit sharp, like the winter air against bare skin. Elias's childhood had been a waiting that turned to silence, a silence that hardened into manhood. He knew the hollow look in the boy's eyes because he had worn it once. By day he worked as he always had, for work was the only answer a man could give to sorrow. He split logs until his shoulders ached, oiled his tools until they gleamed like steel-grey water, mended the sagging fence along the east pasture. And always, the boy was there, Nantan, though Elias had only just learned the name. He trailed quietly, like a shadow learning the shape of the man it followed. At first, Elias found it unsettling, the weight of those dark eyes watching his every motion. But as days turned, something softened in that silence. One morning Elias found the horse standing calm, strands of twine braided into its manet. The boy's work, clumsy but careful, a gift of patience. Another day, Nantan laid a handful of winter berries on the porch, his expression solemn, as if offering tribute. And at night, when the fire burned low, Elias would glance up from his chair to find the boy listening, not speaking, just absorbing the rhythm of the flames, the sound of a man breathing in a house that had been too long empty. Yet the world beyond the cabin did not soften. Word spread, as it always does in small towns, carried by boots on wood floors and whispers over whiskey. In the saloon, men leaned close and muttered. Some said Elias had gone soft, others said he had gone mad. One evening, while Elias nursed a cup of bitter coffee outside the store, a rancher stopped, spat in the dirt at his boots, and let his words fall sharp. "You feed the enemy, McGraw. Ain't your business to raise what should have been left to the coyotes." Elias felt the burn of the coffee through the tin, his palm blistering, but he did not loosen his grip. He looked at the man, eyes flat as a winter sky, and said nothing. Silence was heavier than any curse, and after a moment the rancher shifted, spat again, and walked on. That night Elias set his rifle by the door, the barrel cleaned, the powder dry. He sat in the rocking chair while the firelight touched the shawl by the door, touched the boy's sleeping form beneath the quilt. Shadows moved in the corners of the room, memories wearing familiar shapes. He had taken the boy into his house, but now the house felt like a crossroads, the air thick with the past and the danger of days yet to come. Elias leaned back, listening to the steady breath of the child, and knew that what he had begun was no small act of charity. He was holding back more than hunger from the door. He was holding back the loneliness that had consumed him since the grave on the ridge, and the anger of men who had no patience for compassion. The shadows pressed close, but in the boy's presence, Elias found himself unwilling to yield. The storm came on sudden, like a wild thing loosed across the valley. By dusk the wind was screaming through the cottonwoods, bending their black arms until they snapped. Snow rose in whirling columns, blotting out the ridges, scouring the fences bare. Elias banked the fire high, the logs spitting resin and throwing sparks against the stone hearth. The cabin shuddered beneath the weight of the gale, its timbers groaning like an old ship at sea. Nantan lay close to the flames, wrapped in the quilt, his eyes wide but silent. He had learned not to speak fear aloud, though Elias could see it in the way his small hands clutched the fabric. Outside, the world was blind with white, the roof drumming with snow. Elias poured water into a pot, watching it tremble from the shaking walls. Then came the knock. 3 hard raps, cutting through the roar of the blizzard. Elias froze, ladle in hand, his heart tightening against his ribs. No neighbor would be out in this weather. No man with sense would walk the ridges tonight. The knock came again, deliberate, like a command. He set down the ladle and reached for the rifle by the door. The boy sat upright, his breath quick, his eyes locked on the wood planks as though he already knew who waited there. Elias lifted the latch and pulled the door open against the force of the wind. 3 figures stood in the storm, shawls whipped with snow, hair long and braided, faces marked with lines of hunger and hardship. Their eyes were black as obsidian, fierce and watchful. One carried a knife low at her side, the blade glinting faintly even in the storm's dim light. Another cradled a bundle against her chest, wrapped tight in cloth. The third stepped forward, her gaze cutting past Elias into the cabin's firelit glow. "He is ours," she said, voice rough, each word edged with certainty. At once Nantan scrambled from his place on the floor, his legs weak but urgent. He staggered, and Elias's hand, without thought, reached to steady him. For the space of a heartbeat the boy's small shoulder rested in his palm, caught between 2 worlds. The women entered without asking, the storm pushing them over the threshold. Snow spun across the floorboards before Elias could shove the door closed. The cabin filled with the sharp scent of cold, of sweat, of leather soaked through. They stood in the cramped space, eyes roaming, weighing every corner, the fire's crackle, the bread cooling on the shelf, the rifle in Elias's grip. Their silence pressed heavier than the storm outside. The boy clung to the youngest woman, who knelt to smooth his hair, her lips moving in words Elias could not catch. Relief softened her hard features, but when she looked up at Elias, the distrust returned like a blade drawn from its sheath. No one spoke for a long while. The fire snapped, snow rattled against the shutters, and breath clouded in the thin lamplight. Elias lowered the rifle but did not put it away. Their presence filled the room with a weight he had not felt in years, not even in war. It was as if the walls themselves had grown smaller, the air tighter. Through fragments of speech, gestures, scattered English words, the boy's tired attempts, Elias learned enough. They were kin, women who had walked miles of wilderness, scouring the valley for the child left behind. Hunger had driven them, grief had sharpened them. Their eyes spoke more than words, they had lost much, and they would not lose him too. Still, no trust grew between them. They sat by the fire, their bodies rigid, their knives never far. Elias moved with deliberate calm, tending the pot, laying out what bread he had. Every action felt like stepping along a narrow ridge where one wrong move could mean the fall. Outside, the storm erased the land, burying fence and trail alike beneath its weight. Inside, 5 souls shared the same flickering firelight, each bound by necessity, none by choice. Elias felt the heat of their suspicion as surely as he felt the blaze on his face. Yet when he looked at Nantan, curled safe at last against his kin, he knew the truth of it. In saving the boy, he had invited more than hunger and memory into his cabin. He had invited an old conflict, fierce and unyielding, and it now breathed the same air he did. The storm would pass, but what lingered beneath his roof would not be so easily driven away. The storm lingered, day after day, swallowing the valley until the world beyond the cabin ceased to exist. Snow pressed against the windows, muffling sound, burying the fences, sealing them into a pocket of silence. Inside, the air was tight with watchfulness. Elias moved through his own house like a guest who dared not make too much noise. The women said little. Their eyes did most of the speaking, dark, alert, measuring him. The youngest, Tala, tended to Nantan with patient hands. Each morning she brushed his tangled hair and wove it into neat braids, her fingers moving with quiet skill. Elias often found himself watching, unbidden. The sight brought back Anna in a rush, her steady hands braiding their boy's hair before Sunday church, the child squirming and laughing under her touch. The memory cut sharp, like a blade honed thin. He would turn away then, splitting logs or stoking the fire, hiding the ache behind the work. The older woman, stern-faced and scarred by hardship, kept her knife always within reach. Her gaze followed Elias each time his hand drifted near the rifle above the mantel. Her suspicion filled the room like smoke, clinging to every movement he made. At night, when Elias sat in the rocking chair, its creak echoed louder than it should have, as though the chair itself passed judgment. Still, life demanded its rituals. Each dawn Elias brewed coffee, the bitter steam curling into the chill air. Bread baked in the coals, its crust blackening at the edges. The women took what he offered, their hands steady but their eyes wary. Every act of sharing, water ladled into cups, food divided on the table, felt like a fragile treaty that might break with a wrong glance. It was on the 4th evening that the peace cracked. A knock sounded, sudden and hard, not like the cautious tap of kin but the heavy fist of men with anger to spare. Elias opened the door to find 3 settlers, their cheeks flushed with drink, breath steaming in the cold. Their eyes darted past him into the cabin, landing on the women gathered by the fire. "You've lost your damn mind, McGraw," one slurred, his words thick with whiskey. "Harboring them. Feeding them. You think we'll let that stand?" Another stepped forward, spitting into the snow, voice rough with scorn. "They ain't got no place here. You send 'em out, or we'll do it for you." The women tensed, hands slipping to their knives. Nantan pressed against Tala's skirt, wide-eyed. Elias felt the weight of his rifle in his arms, steady, familiar. He did not raise it, not yet. He simply stood there in the doorway, broad and unmoving, his silence heavier than the storm behind him. "Step aside, McGraw," the first man growled, shoving at the doorframe. Elias's shotgun came up in one slow motion, the barrel gleaming in the lamplight. His eyes never left theirs. He said nothing, didn't need to. The stillness of him, the set of his shoulders, spoke louder than words. The men faltered, muttering, shifting under his unyielding gaze. One cursed low and spat again. Then, with the storm clawing at their backs, they turned and stumbled into the snow. Elias closed the door, the latch dropping like a verdict. For a long while the room was silent but for the fire's crackle. The women watched him, their expressions unreadable. But something had changed in the space between them. The suspicion did not vanish, it would not so easily, but in their eyes flickered a new thing. Not gratitude, not yet, but respect born of a man who had stood his ground against his own kind. Elias set the rifle back on its rest and sat once more in the rocking chair. The firelight caught on their faces, softening them in ways he had not seen before. The cabin remained tense, every breath measured, but the air felt altered. The storm outside raged on, but within, the lines had shifted. For the first time, Elias sensed that the walls of his home did not hold strangers anymore, but companions bound by a fragile, dangerous trust. When the storm finally broke, the world lay changed. The valley stretched beneath the pale sky, blanketed in snow so deep it seemed the earth itself had been buried. Fences rose only as dark lines above the drifts, and the cottonwoods stood stark against the white, their branches heavy with silence. The air was sharp, still, carrying that strange quiet that follows a blizzard, when even the wind seems to have exhausted itself. Inside the cabin, life shifted from survival to something subtler. Elias put axe to wood again, showing Nantan how to find the grain and split clean. The boy's hands were clumsy, but he watched closely, eager to mimic every motion. Later, Elias sat him down with broken tack, teaching him to mend leather with steady stitches. The boy's small fingers fumbled with the awl, yet his eyes burned with determination. Each mistake became practice, each knot tied him tighter to the rhythm of the cabin. Tala watched from the doorway, her shawl drawn close. She said nothing, but Elias could feel her gaze. There was weight in it, not suspicion this time, but something else, a stillness born of watching a man tend to what he could have ignored. When their eyes met, she did not look away. That night, when the boy had gone to sleep and the fire dimmed low, she remained by the hearth. Elias noticed her hands folded in her lap, Anna's old shawl resting there. He had offered it days before, against the bitter cold, but seeing it draped across Tala's shoulders stirred something unexpected. The fabric was a bridge, threads of widowhood and womanhood woven together, carrying memory from one life into another. They sat in the firelight, shadows deepening on the log walls. Words were scarce, yet meaning grew in the spaces between them. Through broken English, gestures, and silences, stories slowly emerged. Tala spoke of her husband, lost in a raid that had left her village with more graves than homes. Her voice was flat, but her eyes shone with the kind of grief that never loosens its grip. Elias listened, and when her words faded, he spoke softly of Anna, of the grave beneath the cottonwoods where snow always gathered deepest. For a moment the fire seemed to burn warmer. They did not reach for one another, but their grief met across the silence, recognizing its twin. Understanding settled between them, not passion, but the quiet knowledge that sorrow binds as fiercely as joy. Yet outside the fragile peace, danger thickened. Elias heard it in town, carried on bitter tongues and the slam of whiskey bottles. Men saying the rancher had turned his home into a den for the enemy. One voice louder than the rest promised a cleansing, rifles at dawn, to drive out what did not belong. Elias sat still in the corner of the saloon, his jaw clenched, the weight of their words falling like stones. He left without speaking, the cold night biting against his face, and rode home with a heaviness he had not felt in years. At the cabin he oiled his rifle, laying each piece out with deliberate care. The smell of gunmetal filled the room, sharp and final. He placed Anna's wedding band on the table, its circle catching the firelight. For an instant, it seemed he was asking her blessing, asking the ghost who lingered in every beam and every shadow to guide his hand in what was to come. Tala watched from across the room, her expression unreadable. She saw the rifle gleam, saw the band glimmer on the wood, saw the set of his shoulders, a man who had already chosen to stand, even if it meant falling. Something shifted in her then. She crossed the space quietly, knelt beside him, and placed her hand over his scarred one. She said nothing. Words would have been too fragile for what was carried in that single touch. Elias did not look at her, nor did he move away. He let the warmth of her hand rest on his, the firelight painting them both in the same glow. The storm outside had passed, but another was coming, fiercer than snow or wind. And for the first time, he knew he would not be facing it alone. The dawn broke hard and cold, the snow crusted with ice that cracked beneath hooves. Elias heard them before he saw them, voices raised, the jangle of tack, the clatter of rifles shifting against saddle leather. 6 riders, their faces red from whiskey and wind, rode up through the drifts with purpose carved into their shoulders. "Send them out, Elias," one bellowed, voice carrying sharp in the brittle air. "This is white man's land. You've no right keeping them under your roof." Elias stepped onto the porch, his boots sinking deep, shotgun cradled in steady hands. The barrel pointed low but sure, his stance calm, immovable. Behind him, the door creaked, and the 3 Apache women stood close together, shawls wrapped tight, dark eyes burning like flint. Nantan clung to Tala's skirt, his breath puffing in frightened clouds. Elias spoke little. His words carried weight enough, "They stay." The silence that followed was brittle as glass. One of the riders spat into the snow, another tightened his grip on his rifle. The threat was no longer words, it was in the way they leaned forward in their saddles, in the twitch of trigger fingers. The first shot cracked the morning open. The blast rang out sharp against the frozen valley, and snow leapt where the bullet struck the porch beam. Elias's shotgun answered, the recoil slamming against his shoulder as one rider pitched sideways into the drifts, a stain of red blooming across the white. The world shrank to smoke and thunder. Elias fought not with fury but with the grim steadiness of a man who knew what must be done. He fired, ducked, reloaded. A ball grazed his arm, hot and searing, another tore through his coat. He felt the burn of pain but pressed on, teeth set, hands unshaking. The women pulled Nantan inside, shielding him, though Tala remained at the threshold, her face lit by firelight and fear, her eyes fixed on Elias as if willing him to stand. 2 settlers fell back, one clutching a shattered shoulder, another tumbling into the snow with a cry that echoed into silence. The rest broke, turning their horses, cursing, retreating down the frozen slope. They had seen enough of a man who would not bend. When the echoes faded, Elias stood alone in the yard, shotgun lowered, steam rising from his breath and the wound in his side. The snow beneath him was no longer pure, streaked now with blood both his and theirs. He swayed but did not fall. The women came quickly, guiding him inside. Tala pressed cloth to his side, her hands firm, unflinching. Another heated water, another fetched Anna's shawl to wrap against the chill. There were no words, only the rough, necessary motions of survival. By midday, they carried the fallen settler to the Cartonwoods. The ground was frozen, but they dug as best they could, their breaths ragged, shovels ringing against stone. Elias watched the mound rise, his face unreadable. It was not vengeance that lowered the man into the earth, but acknowledgement. The land took all men in time, no matter which side they'd chosen. Days later, as the thaw began, the cabin grew quiet. The women prepared to leave, gathering their few belongings, fastening shawls against the wind. Nantan clung to Tala, reluctant, though his eyes shone with relief at the thought of returning to kin. Elias said little, standing in the yard, his arm bound, leaning heavy on his rifle. When they mounted, Tala lingered. She turned once, her gaze meeting his across the snow, something unspoken passing between them. Then she rode on, her figure shrinking into the horizon until the whiteness swallowed her. Evening came slow. Elias lowered himself into the rocking chair, Anna's shawl folded across his knees. The cabin seemed emptier, yet not as it once had. The silence was still there, but it carried warmth now, not hollowness. He had offered shelter, raised his gun in defense, bound wounds not only of flesh but of pride. And in return, something in him had been stitched back together. Loneliness remained, but it was no longer a void. It was a companion, tempered by firelight and memory. The snow outside glowed under the moon, the rocking chair creaked, and Elias sat steady, his heart no longer hollow but carrying a quiet flame, enough to endure the long nights ahead.